Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by the full crew today. Beau, Cody, Tracy, all together. How are you guys doing?
Excellent.
Fantastic.
I
Awesome.
love it. Matt's in studio. Karen's sitting next to me, telling me whatever I need to say. She's the brains behind the operation. And so, Cody, what are we going to talk about today?
The genius of patience.
Yes, the genius of patience. And this came to us yesterday in a meeting. We had a meeting with some wonderful people. And, well, Cody, why don't you tell the story how this came about?
Yeah, we were just meeting with a group that we're going to do some partnership stuff with. And they, in the midst of the meeting, we were talking about, how we run companies and how are you nimble as a team and how we make decisions. And one of them brought up this really interesting saying that was painted. A buddy of his went to medical school, and in the hospital at the medical school, they had a mural or a painting above where the doctors met that said, don't just do something, stand there. And he was explaining that the message behind that is so often, especially in the medical profession, but we do this in all sorts of businesses and in our team environments, we move right to action and they misdiagnose, or they don't take the time to actually assess what's really going on. And a bias towards action can sometimes lead you down the wrong path.
Right. And when in doubt, it's good to act. Like when you're like on the fence, it's like, but that doesn't mean acting is always the best thing. And Karen's son, Michael, who's getting married next week, probably will be getting married right about when this comes out. He was a EMT, and the paramedic, they have a motto that says, don't make their emergency your emergency. So there you are in the ER or in an emergency situation, and people are panicking. And so what happens, we go, we got to do something. Well, sometimes you've got to observe and take a moment to think. And in the workplace or at home, sometimes we are so wanting to act that we don't take enough time to think and to consider and to have patience. And as a person with very little patience, I'm working on that. This is one of those things I love to think about because I need to get better.
And we were talking about this topic and this idea, and it connects so directly to Working Genius. And we have an office where there's lots and lots of discernment, as you all know who listen to the podcast. And I know that teams or people like me who have galvanizing as a genius, there is a magnet in galvanizing to want to get moving. In fact, there are magnets for any of the lower level geniuses to want to drive towards completion, to drive towards action. And like you said, Pat, that is fantastic. And one of the principles of the Working Genius model is to do the work in order. And so there is a genius to be able to first discern before we move into galvanizing. And that's easy to say, and we can see it on a model, but we have to often be disciplined to stand there.
Absolutely. And by the way, I just want to say this again. When we say lower level, it's because we look at altitude. So lower level just means closer to the ground. It's because boy, the last thing we want somebody to think is, well, it's lower level priority or importance to be G, E, or T. But G, E, and T is really biased toward action, which we love. But there is something about being able to hold that off. And if you're a team that has a bunch of G's, a bunch of T's, even a bunch of E's, there's going to be like, okay, let's move. And I suppose in a world where you have to do just one or the other, that's probably a pretty good thing to do, but we should never do just one or the other. And there's a real genius and a wisdom about being patient enough to say, maybe this needs more reflection. And maybe we need to move back up to W for a while.
Yeah, and I love this, Pat, because it's, we've used the relay race sort of analogy here. We're not saying you should bias towards standing there forever or bias towards action. The appropriate way, the best teams are actually discerning, doing the right amount of discernment and assessing the problem and evaluating and picking the right solution and then moving to galvanizing. And so the idea, I love, Beau, that you pointed out our team in particular having a strong presence of discernment. There are probably times where we should have gotten to galvanizing a little faster. We've discerned the right thing, and then we kind of make sure I do this thing with Tracy because she's our resident discerner here. And if I get 3 yeses from Tracy, I'm like, okay, now I know for sure, but there's probably times where 2 yeses was plenty. And sometimes we over discern But the relationship between D and G is super important, discerning and galvanizing.
Yeah. Absolutely, Cody. And it's crazy. Before we had this model, in fact, we spent years, because we didn't have any galvanizing in our office, we spent years in that ID cycle way too often. We had the bias in that direction, and we were not taking as much action as we should.
And it's interesting because that's how this model came about. We would almost wait till I got grumpy. Because grumpy was where I was when I galvanized. Like, crap, I have to galvanize. And it was like, well, Pat's grumpy. It's time to move. It's like, that was not a good, that's how this whole model came about. It's like, why am I grumpy so much? Because you're galvanizing all the time. We love the galvanizing, but sometimes we need to have patience. Beau?
I had a moment that made me think about this last week. I went to the dentist. I had a 7 a.m. dentist appointment. I go into there's several people in the waiting room. I go in the chair. The dentist is probably feeling pressure to get moving. And I'm sitting in the chair, and the person comes and, cleans my teeth. And then he went, and instead of getting right to action, he went and sat down in a chair. I've never seen a dentist do this. And he put my chair up, and he just listened to me for a little bit. He's like, now tell me what's going on. And do you have any pain? And is anything uncomfortable? And tell me what this was a new dentist. Tell me what people have done before. It was so remarkable to me that he took 3, 4, 5 minutes to first really understand before he got in there and started drilling. And he even said, I said, this is sort of interesting that you're doing this. He said, we get so much pressure to bill you for lots of things and to try to do lots of, repairs and to upsell you on things. He's like, I really want to understand what's the core issue that's happening before I get in there and start drilling. So simple. Mm-hmm. And he took that to heart of I'm not just going to do something. I'm going to sit here first to understand.
It's so interesting in the medical profession where diagnosis, that's kind of what this comes down to. Diagnosis is part of what discernment is, right? Mm-hmm. And so we were talking yesterday about being in the ER or in the hospital, like that guy was saying. It's like there's a guy, we talked about like a consultant standing 10 feet behind or 5 feet behind the people working on the patient, just watching. And what a good thing that would be. They're just watching. They're just far enough away to be a little bit more objective and not into the emergency. And they might have the observation that everybody needs. But too often, the people, and we've all been talking about medical diagnosis recently, where people just get it wrong because they're too close to it and they're not looking at the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pat, so as we're sort of teasing out this relationship between how does a team decide or when do they know when we're moving from discernment to galvanizing, I was in a room with one of our certified master facilitators who teach our certification class, and they were drawing the 6 types of working genius up on a whiteboard. And we've done this hundreds of times, and he did a very interesting thing. He drew a dotted line between discernment and galvanizing. If you picture those 6 gears as our model. And he said, he referred to that to the team as like, this is sort of the decision line. Once you've discerned what the problem, or, you've wondered what the problem is, your team has invented possible solutions, you've evaluated and refined the one that you think. Once you cross that line is when it moves into action. Like we're now going to galvanize the decision we've made. And if there's not clarity about when you cross that line, if you maybe galvanize a little too quickly or you move to tenacity even all the way down to executing, the teams that are really getting a lot of value out of this type of, in this mode between discernment and galvanizing are really clear about, okay, we're on the same page. We have the plan. We've made the decision. We're now moving to execution on that decision.
And very simply, a way that teams are able to use that is incorporating working genius into their language. So if you're talking to somebody like me who's a galvanizer, it's very, very helpful to say, we're going to need you to galvanize someday. That day is not today. Or we're still discerning. We'll let you know when it's time to galvanize because we want to get to work and do that. And it's helpful to know when that help is going to be needed.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? And then, so let's just say you do that. You go from D to G, and now we're moving. It's still important that W's and I's and D's are in those meetings because, and if they're self-aware, they can say, "Hey, you guys, I know that we're out of the W mode, or we're out of D mode, or whatever else, or I mode." And if they're self-aware enough to say that, they can say, "But I'm wondering if we shouldn't move back up again because I'm seeing new things." So we should never commit and say, "Well, now we're Gene, we're all done." there are many moments where we have to go, let's go back and revisit. So it's not a black and white thing, but generally speaking, when you pass from D to G, you're now in implementation mode, and it should take a lot of effort or a lot of discernment to decide we need to go back and discern some more. I mean, that's kind of a circular argument.
Well, and I think there's micro wonder, invention, and discernment that goes on once you get to that galvanizing as well. So it's not like you're completely done with that, because there's micro moments in the midst of getting things done. Yeah,
you're wondering about and inventing and discerning about the right way to get it done, not whether or not it's the right idea.
Exactly.
That's really important, Tracy, that you said that, because sometimes people go, well, we've already finished W and I-ing. What do we got left? It's like, no, let's just contain and contextualize our W and I-ing around how we're getting it done. That's a really good point.
I'll even give a real life example, because I think those points you made are so critical for teams, which is like, hey, it's not that then we can't go back and rediscern or back and re-micro invent or innovate, because Beau and I, with some members of our team, Ashley and a few others, we decided that, hey, we're going to put a workshop page on our website, and we want people that want us to come work with teams around Working Genius to go to that site, enter their team situation, and we're going to help them. So we made the macro decision that that's what we needed to do. And we've had to rediscern what that information we get on that page is and how we put it up there 3 or 4 different times, because we're like, oh, we know that the idea is the right idea, but we need to tweak and change. So we've gone back to invention and discernment even after the galvanizing many times and iterating on that decision.
You know, I love that. I've never thought about this before, but like tweaking is a WID activity within the context of getting something done. Sometimes we think we have to WID the whole thing, but like the whole idea of tweaking is actually applying that within a certain context. So now you shouldn't go out and go, I'm a tweaker, because that is a different, but
that would be very different.
Yes. But that's interesting, because my wife, Laura, she's a WI, and she's like, gosh, well, what is that? It's like, no, keep WIing, but do it within this context. You can help us tweak along the way.
Yeah, Cody, in that example, I think something that was really helpful is space. Is we put the website out there, we put the words out there, and then we need a little bit of time to see how people who are interested, what comes in and how they describe their interest. And one of the things Cody and I say all the time, we've probably said in this podcast, is that almost every deadline is made up. And if you are somebody who has tenacity in particular, and probably, if you're like me and you're more wired for deadlines and structure, it's harder to believe that the deadline that you gave yourself is actually totally artificial. The vast majority of, unless you're pregnant or about to get married and there's a real date on the calendar, most dates are artificial. Most deadlines can be moved. And that's a helpful thing for those of us who are perhaps galvanizers or really structured to keep in mind.
I think that's what's so interesting about using the medical school or the emergency room as an example, because there's a deadline there too. It's like somebody's life is on line. They're bleeding. But even then you have to have enough patience to properly diagnose. And so if even in those, like, I think that's what I love about that sign in the med school, don't just do something, stand there. It's like, it takes a while to wrap your head around that, which is why it's so cool. But even there, you have to have patience. Yeah. And so, but in other things where there's no cost to pushing things off, if it's the right thing to do, have you talked about the magnets of G&T, Beau? Did you mention that?
I think we did a little bit. Yeah, that there is this well, all of us are drawn to make every conversation and every, meeting into the sort of meeting that we like. But there is this natural pull, magnetic pull of, like we talked about, some of those lower elevation geniuses. And in particular, in my experience, I feel that pull from galvanizing and tenacity. Cody, I'm curious if you would agree with that in particular. They're more disruptive. They're driving to get things moving and to completion.
Yeah, and sometimes it can create, like, I loved your analogy there, a false sense of urgency. There are real senses of urgency in the situations you described, but that can cloud, that can cause someone to not do the patient thing and take a step back and observe and go, hey, is this still the right plan? Do we still need to tweak? Have we made those decisions? And so I think you're absolutely right. There is a force around tenacity to say, hey, we have the plan. Let's get all the way to the finish line as quickly as possible. And there's an interplay with that and all the other geniuses.
Well, and so this just drives me to want to talk about GTs. And so Jackie, who works in our office and has for years, we love Jackie, one of our favorite human beings in the world. And I was just thinking, Jackie's like a racehorse. You put them in the gate and they're like chomping at the bit. They're ready to go. They're literally, hey, that's where chomping at the bit comes from, isn't it? And they really want to get out and they want to go, but you got to keep the doors closed until you know you're ready to go. Because Jackie is always ready to act. And we love that about her. She knows herself too, but it's such an interesting thing. Like, every organization loves having GTs because they get stuff done, but you got to know when to open the gates. And as some self-awareness, if you are a GT and know that you have that bias for action, even if it's early, is a really good thing.
And that's why this awareness between the decisions we make when we're done discerning, because Jackie really is chomping at the bit. And sometimes you're evaluating an idea, you're actually discerning it, and it sounds to her like the decision has been made, and she'll get out of the gate and go get it done. And then we have to walk back all of that to go, we hadn't crossed that decision line yet. We were still on the other side of galvanizing in the discernment area, evaluating and refining it. So that's totally right. If you get clear as a team about, hey, here is the decision, and now we can open that gate, it will solve a lot of problems and a lot of headaches, and you don't have to walk back any work or any productivity that someone's kind of already established because we were not clear enough in the first place.
Yeah, Karen just asked me a question. It's a great one too. It's like, how do we know when we've discerned enough? I mean, I know this is an art, not a science, but how do you know when it's like enough discernment?
Well, when Tracy says. No,
when Tracy says that's enough.
No,
what if you don't have a Tracy on your team?
I do think that sometimes it feels like there's a little pressure testing of the discernment. Like, we make a decision, and then it's like, if 2 days later you go back to ID and you arrive at the same conclusion and everybody feels good, if there's not like a yellow flag in Tracy's gut, I'm like, oh, okay, good. If there's still a little yellow flag, I'm like, okay, so maybe we need to reinvent or rediscern this. But if you arrive at the same conclusion a couple times, it feels like, okay, that feels like the discernment has landed and we're in a good spot. That's how I feel like it plays out on our team a little bit.
That's great.
I love that answer. I think so often sitting on it or sleeping on it helps to be able to confirm. I love that quote. I think it's from our favorite president, Benjamin Franklin, who says, don't decide today. He says, don't decide today something that can reasonably be put off till tomorrow. Isn't that so good?
And the key is reasonably.
Reasonably, exactly. The decision on Monday that you're like, hey, we're going to move. Sometimes there's a tiny little pink flag in your gut that says, let's sleep on it and see how we feel about it tomorrow.
Wow, that's the difference between impatience and prudence, isn't it? Like, why are we making that decision now? And if it's like, because I just want to have it done and I want to say it's finished, versus, I think it would be good to wait a little bit. Yeah, all of life is an art, isn't it? All of life is an art. All right. Okay, that brings us to the end of this podcast. Do we have something we want to throw out to people there, Beau?
Yeah, lots of you who listen have read the book, The 6 Types of Working Genius, and have asked for a resource to be able to help you talk about that with others. And so we have a book discussion guide, and Matt's going to put the link to that in the show notes. You can find that on our website. Totally free resource to be able to generate great conversation with other people who are reading the book, or at least who are saying that they're reading the book. We know how that goes.
Maybe they don't have to read it. They can just go through the questions then and pretend like they're, when you go to book club and you don't know, so you get the Cliff Notes. What's interesting, Beau? You made me think of something. I wonder if people out there have a question, and that is, why didn't we put the assessment in the book? And the reason why we didn't do that is because when we came up with this idea, it takes a while to write a book, but we were like, we got to get the assessment out. We launched the assessment more than a year before the book came out. And so when it came time to do the book, we just couldn't slide it in there. And we wanted to make sure that people didn't necessarily have to buy a book and chop down a tree if they wanted to take the assessment. So we kept them separate. So just so people know that, I think it's worth, because we thought about that, like, boy, we should put that in there. And we decided no, because then the people that have already taken the assessment don't have a book. And if a team wants to roll this out to 500 people, do they have to buy 500 books? That doesn't seem to make sense. So that's what we were thinking. And maybe it's worth sharing that with everybody, just to let you know. And we did discern that decision. Karen reminds me, we took time to discern that. We probably discerned it for a few weeks. And
I think it was longer than that, actually.
Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining us. We love talking to you about Working Genius and how it's changing people's lives and companies. And we'll look forward to talking to you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.